Hi, Josh Centers here. Apple's moderation of the App Store is nothing new, but it's been sticking in my craw more and more lately. And some recent comments by Tim Cook have kind of brought it back in the news and brought it to a head. And I wanted to address that real quick and some of my own issues with it. So, Tim Cook was recently given an award by the Anti Defamation League. And he got up on stage and gave this big, high and mighty speech, talking about how wonderful Apple is, of course, and how moral and just Apple is. And I'm just going to quote this for you. This is from TechCrunch. From the earliest days of iTunes to Apple Music today, we have always prohibited music with a message of white supremacy. Okay, well, that's fine. All right. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. Okay. And as we showed this year, we won't give a platform to violent conspiracy theorists on the App Store. Now, if you don't know what he's talking about, he's alluding to Alex Jones of InfoWars fame, who Apple at first they banned the podcast from their podcast directory, and then later they banned their app from the App Store, and this caused an entire avalanche of other social media sites banning Alex Jones and InfoWars and related accounts. Continue on with the speech. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. My friends, if we can't be clear on moral questions like these, then we've got big problems. At Apple, we are not afraid to say that our values drive our curation decisions. And why should we be? Doing what's right, creating experiences free from violence and hate, experiences that empower creativity and new ideas, is what our customers want us to do. Technology should be about human potential. It should be about optimism. And we believe the future should belong to those who use technology to build a better, more inclusive, and more hopeful world. And so that all sounds well and good, but here is the problem. So, when they regulate what can be in Apple Music, what they regulate can be what can be on the iTunes Store, you as a consumer still have a choice. Apple's making the choice to not promote a certain sort of content, which is their right to do. The problem, though, with the App Store is that you don't have any sort of recourse. Apple is effectively saying, this is what you are allowed to do with the machines you buy from us. In other words, your computer, whether it's an iPhone, an iPad, probably someday Mac, as that gets more and more restricted, that does not belong to you. It fundamentally belongs to us, and we get to decide what you do on it. Apple is fundamentally taking away your ownership of your own device. Now, sadly, predictably, the response, at least here in Ars Technica, one of the last few tech sites that actually allows comments, is all, oh, well, if you don't like this, you're a Nazi. Because one thing we know about Nazis is that they were huge supporters of freedom of speech. One, yeah, the Nazis were the big anti-authoritarians, as everyone knows. People are just sort of ridiculous anymore. I can't even make hide or hair of some of the arguments people make about things. And I'm not going to argue this as a free speech issue. There's no free speech involved. Apple has their own platform. They are totally within their rights to do with it as they see fit. Just as they can choose what books to have in their iBooks store. They can choose what books to have. Choose what music to have in Apple Music. They can choose what movies to have in iTunes. Although I do think it's interesting, a lot of men who have been accused of rape or sexual misconduct still have titles in the iTunes movie store. So if is Apple responsible for that now? They still have a bunch of Woody Allen movies in the iTunes store. You can sort of see where this sort of extrapolation can get kind of ridiculous after a certain point, and you have to ask, where do we draw the line? But even if you hate Alex Jones, I'm not a fan. Look, I think there has to be a screw loose in your head to be able to listen to that guy for 3 hours every weekday. But this extends beyond just political content. For example, Apple doesn't allow emulators in the App Store. Apple banned the Steam Link app from the App Store, and they were quite open about it being strictly for business reasons. And you have to ask yourself, look, I've owned iPhones, iPads, Macs for a long time, and you have to ask yourself, who actually owns this device? Who gets to decide what I run on my computer? I mean, this is fundamentally, it's not a question of free speech, it's a question of ownership. And you're forking all this money over to Apple, who truly owns the device? And that, to me, is the real issue. So I'm just going to cut through a lot of the bullshit here. Let's be honest, this is largely a left versus right issue. The tech industry is largely dominated by people on the left who are angry that Donald Trump is president, and they're trying to exert all the power they can muster to prevent that or anything like it from happening again. Here's the problem, is that when you start using those powers, they tend to have a way to come back and bite you. or if you give those powers to a higher authority, that tends to come back and bite you. And I don't. This isn't a hypothetical. You know, a lot of people say, "Well, you know, you free speech maximalists are just using a bunch of fake slippery slopes." No, I have a real world example. Tumblr. Tumblr just announced that they are banning all pornographic content from their website. And this is largely acknowledged to be a response to Apple, who banned the Tumblr app from the iOS App Store a couple of weeks ago for what they claimed was pedophilia being allowed on the Tumblr platform. Now, look, I'm just going to lay my cards on the table. I'm a Christian. I do not like pornography. I'm not going to lie and claim I've never viewed it. I have been on the internet for over 20 years, but you know, I don't think it's been a good thing for people. I don't think violent video games are a good thing for people. But heck, you know what? Here's the thing, though, is I'm also intelligent enough to understand that when you give authority to the morality police to police things like that, they tend to be rather ham-fisted. It's just why, you know, I don't drink. I don't think drinking is a good thing, but I would be against passing prohibition again, because as we saw, prohibition, you know, back when that was a thing in the early part of the 20th century in the United States, was not a good thing, and it led to a lot of bad stuff. There can be all sorts of unintended consequences. My concern with this happening is that Apple has basically exerted influence over the open web. This is no longer Apple just exerting influence over its own apps in the App Store. It's actually pressured a company to edit the content on its website, which is really interesting. Now, look, I'm not a big Tumblr user, but I've never known of it being, I've never heard of pedophilia being an issue there. I mean, I'm sure there's some there. I mean, just like it is on any site like this. You know, I'm sure if you dug through Twitter, Facebook, any platform where you can share pictures, you're probably going to find some content like that, unfortunately. It's just always the way the web has worked. Hey, look, I'm willing to bet there's probably people sharing such images like that through iCloud photo sharing. You know, is Apple going to start peeking through your photos and telling you which photos you're allowed to share? You know, at what point does the enforcement become worse than what's actually happening? And of course, you know, now a lot of people on the left are crying and moaning because, you know, Tumblr is sort of known for being a left-leaning site. A lot of people credit it with being the home of the modern-day social justice movement. And, you know, there's a lot of commentators saying that, oh, you know, this is terrible for the LGBTQ community, et cetera, all while, you know, applauding Tim Cook, you know, striking things they don't like out of the App Store without realizing that that is indeed a double-edged sword. So what am I proposing here? Well, look, I am totally against trying to force Apple to carry things in its stores that it doesn't want to carry. What I do want to see is I wish Apple would allow side loading of apps. And there's actually a case before the Supreme Court that relates to that right now. And I think that's currently more of a procedural stage. I don't think the Supreme Court's actually going to decide if Apple has to allow side loading of apps. But I do. My understanding is they have let that case continue in lower courts. So we're going to see how that plays out. But I don't think it should take a court decision for Apple to do something that I think is very much the right thing to do. Now, the argument historically for Apple having such tight control over the App Store was that it prevents scam apps, it prevents malware. And it's true, iOS has almost no malware to speak of. Unfortunately, we've moved kind of past malware, and now scam apps are a real thing. Developer David Bernard has been involved with the App Store since its very beginning. Very good developer, very well respected. He wrote this great blog post explaining step by step how to game the App Store because he is so frustrated and fed up with all these scam apps in the App Store. And I hate to think how many people are being taken advantage of by this, but this is a really common scam in the App Store. People will buy these sort of off-the-shelf apps. Like here's one. So you pay like $90. I actually think it's less now. You pay $18. You buy the source code for an iOS weather app with AdMob, which is an ad network. So you can buy this, download it, compile it, submit it to the App Store, and Apple more than likely will be okay with it. And you have all these apps that they just make a generic name like weather and stick a symbol at the end or stick another character at the end to game the search function. And then they'll put these ridiculously expensive quarterly subscription. You can try $20 for a year or $10 per quarter. I mean, this is so scammy, and this gets by App Store approval. How is this? For these and these things, these in-app purchases, this is actually one of the better ones because there's a clear X there, but a lot of these will hide the X entirely. I tend to write for an older audience at Tidbits, and there's a lot of kids that buy these apps sometimes without their parents knowing about it. And these are the kinds of people that get ripped off by these sorts of scams, and Apple isn't doing anything about it. So, quite frankly, I don't really care about Tim Cook getting up on stage and showing off these awards he's winning and talking about how great and moral he and Apple is when they're allowing clear scams like this through while they're banning other apps for obvious commercial reasons. I think Apple is a I don't think they're being moral here. I think on the contrary, they're protecting their own business interests. And let's be honest, when one of these scam apps sells an in-app purchase, that helps Apple, and Apple's been super focused on boosting their services revenue. So Apple has every reason, besides ethics and morals, of course, to allow these crappy, scammy apps with their bad in-app purchases through. So I think we really need to be asking, is Apple truly being moral here, or are they just, helping their own business? And frankly, I think it's the latter. I think it's the latter. And the more time goes on, I've always respected Apple's privacy stance, but I think honestly, it's a response to just Google beating the tar out of them in services. If I'm wrong, by all means, prove me wrong. I would love to be wrong on this. I would love to think Tim Cook is, Captain Moral and all this stuff. Frankly, I don't buy it. I think Tim Cook is one of the sharpest cookies and one of the biggest sharks in Silicon Valley, and I'm sure he definitely has some morals and values that drive him. But I think a lot of this is just a business decision. But back to my main point. You need to ask yourself, who owns my device? Do I own it, or does Apple own it? And you also have to ask, what sort of influence is Apple exerting over the open web? And it doesn't matter whether you're an Alex Jones fan or you like watching looking at weird furry porn on Tumblr. It's none of my business. But whether you're on the left or on the right, you should be concerned about Apple influencing this level of influence both over your own devices and the open web. And unfortunately, I'm sure the comments, Twitter, whatever, is going to be full of people calling me a Nazi or whatever. But this used to be something that everyone on the internet used to be able to agree with. I don't know what the hell happened. The internet used to be about freedom and tolerance and liberty, and I don't know anymore. I don't know what the internet's about anymore. People seem to be overwhelmed by all the problems that there are in the world, and they want a strong, iron fist to take care of things. But look, here's the sad thing. When they talk about Mussolini's Italy, people like to say, well, at least the trains ran on time. Sure, he was a tyrant and a dictator, but the trains ran on time. The unfortunate truth, though, is the trains didn't really run on time. That was just kind of a myth. That was just sort of a lie that the fascist supporters made up after the fact. Things actually ran quite poorly, and things tend to run poorly in authoritarian regimes. It's very tempting to give one person or one oligarchy all the power to just fix all the problems and get the red tape out of the way. The reality, though, is that things don't tend to work that way. And look, again, this isn't a hypothetical. Look at Apple. Apple is, using ham-fisted, iron-fisted policies to ban things they don't like from their app store, which is fine. But they're also they're also preventing you from doing things they don't want you to do on their devices. But meanwhile, their app store is full of scams. So again, the trains don't run on time, Apple. And I'm not asking anything ridiculous out of Apple. I'm just saying, just like every Android device in the world, let people sideload their own apps. Let people use their devices how they see fit. After all, they pay enough for them.